Welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for students of counselling and psychotherapy. Here are your hosts, Rory Lees-Oakes and Ken Kelly.
Hello, I'm Rory, and with me is my wingman in all things therapeutic, Ken. How are you doing, Ken?
I'm great, Rory. It's absolutely fantastic to be here. You have tuned in to episode 106 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast, and today we're going to be starting today's episode by looking at using assessment tools in counselling. Practice matters, an exciting one today, and that's unethical behaviour, Rory. Is that from us as counsellors, or is that from a client?
No, that's from us as counsellors. I'm going to speak a little bit about my experience of people being unethical, and also the kind of complaints that ethical bodies receive where sanctions may be applied, sanctions being things that therapists have to do to make sure that their practice goes back to being ethical. So I'm going to be talking about the kind of things that we have to be aware of, which could be unethical behaviour. It's ideal for students because sometimes we don't know what we don't know, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it's great for practicing counsellors as well, because the thing with something like that is when a sanction is levied or a complaint is levied, that it can come out of the blue. It can be so unexpected. So looking at this beforehand rather than at the time, really important. So that's Practice Matters, which we'll be looking at. And we're going to be closing episode 106 by looking at what level of training should you study at, or should you study to? And again, those are questions, Rory, that come up again and again. Where did the questions come from that we're using today?
Well, the questions came from our Facebook group. And if you don't know what our Facebook group is, if you type Counselling Tutor into our Facebook group, you'll find our closed group. Knock on the door, knock, we'll let you in. And there's nearly 25,000 other people in there who are enjoying and engaging with the world of counselling and psychotherapy. Students, as qualified practitioners, there's supervisors, there's tutors, there's myself and Ken, and it really is a big party. People asking questions, asking about their levels of training, asking about assignments, just generally talking about everything in the world of counselling and psychotherapy. Come on in, we're waiting to see you.
Yeah, jump on Facebook, put in the words Counselling Tutor, knock on the door. Biggest support group for counsellors in training and therapists in the world. So get yourself in there. And we're starting off with a question or a topic discussion, I guess, that is taken from the group, and that is using assessment tools in counselling. It's an interesting one, because I remember looking at this in training while studying, and my first reaction, Rory, my gut reaction, because I was on a person-centered course, is no, you can't assess a client. It's not person-centered. And of course, I don't subscribe to that belief anymore. But that was my gut reaction. And I think assessment tools are maybe not covered in depth in training, and I think it's an important topic for us to look at.
Yes, and when we talk about assessment tools, what we're talking about effectively is questionnaires. And what happens is that right at the beginning of therapy, clients given a questionnaire. There's different forms. I'm looking at something called GAD-7, general anxiety and depression would be the name for that. And effectively, what you do is you ask the client to tick between, in this particular assessment tool, between 0 and 3, 0 being no symptoms at all, and 3 nearly every day. And then what you do is you, through the questions, you add up a score. And then when you do a review, you do another assessment and see if the score's gone up or down. And one of the reasons they're used is because a lot of placements now are funded, and of course all funding, if it comes from a UK taxpayer, has to be evidence-based. And one of the ways that you can evidence the base is to show how well therapy is working. So that is why they're used. And yes, and only the other day I got a letter in the postbag, Ken, from someone who turned down a placement because they were saying that they felt it wasn't in the person-centered tradition to use assessment criteria, and the placement manager had said you're going to struggle finding a placement that doesn't do that now. And I'm afraid I do agree with the placement manager. You know, funding is about evidence, and the way the evidence is using either Core 10, which is another tool, or GAD7 or GAD9.
Yeah, 100%. And you're speaking about a process that takes place before the therapeutic relationship is deep. So this is done prior. It would be done at the same time as contracting. So if you're looking at person-centered theory, we need to remember that was a theory of its time. The principles are good today, and we use them in our therapy rooms, but things like don't ask directive questions, that would go to person-centered therapy where it doesn't fit the person-centered therapy model. However, in the assessment, the actual assessment is done prior to the therapeutic relationship deepening. It's like contracting. If you think about it, nothing could be more directive than a contract. I know you're making that with the client, but a contract in itself is not person-centered, yet we need to work within contracts. So I think that it does fit in, and it fits in well, and it evidences not just for the funding, but it can also evidence an outcome for the client themselves, because generally these questionnaires are pre and post. You'll fill it in before the therapy starts in the contracting phase, and then you will fill it in again, and then it is looked at, is there a comparison, is there a difference, has there been any movement? That can really be in service of the client, not just to evidence the funding. Absolutely.
There are advantages and disadvantages to using assessment tools. One of the disadvantages is that they're very subjective. So you're asking somebody, how do you feel today? Is it 1? Is it 2? Is it 3? Is it 4? And sometimes clients may not. Am I a 2? Am I a 3? I'm not so sure. And of course, one of the big disadvantages is that you might do an assessment right at the beginning of therapy. You may do one maybe at the 6-week review, and they've gone backwards. So how do you transmit that to the client? When you came in, you're actually technically on paper feeling worse than when you came in. And I would suggest that may be something that's covered in the contract. The National Counselling Society on their webpage talk about, they're an ethical body, talk about being really honest with the client and saying, in therapy things may get a little worse or they get better. And right at the end, of course, as a final outcome, you can use that as evidence for the efficacy. I think that's the word, the efficacy of the therapy. And a lot of agencies use them now. It is part of the world that we live in. And while I applaud the person who wrote to me's principles about keeping the person-centered flame alight, I'm afraid that in 2019 in contemporary therapeutic services, that is just how the world works.
It is, and I understand the point of saying no, this is not right, because I stood in that same camp early, just after training, and I even implemented using assessment tools in my private practice so that I could monitor and gauge how it was going for clients. And I hear that critique, and I think it's so important that we need to look at both sides of any argument. And I appreciate that critique, Rory, of where are the weaknesses, where can it maybe not do what it is built to do. And you're right. What happens if we are seeing a client that maybe looks like they're regressing, and again, in service of the client, we may be able to, it may point us in the direction of referral. Even in that pre-assessment, we may pick something up by asking those direct questions, even though they are on paper and the client is kind of reading them, they're filling that in, and it could highlight a need for referral for something that we may not even have considered, something that may only have come up later on in therapy. For example, suicidal thoughts. Have you had any suicidal thoughts? And this would be something that may be asked on one of those assessments. And it's interesting when we look back, we've recently done a podcast speaking about research, and research has been kind of a topic definitely on our Facebook page recently, with a lot of learners doing their research project that they need to do with their peers. And we spoke about qualitative and quantitative research and the differences between those. And quantitative research, very much just numbers. You got kind of numbers, scales from 1 to 5, and you're going to kind of work out an average. And it is a quantitative measuring tool, but you also get, and I guess that is a weakness, but you also get to bring in the qualitative side of that in therapy itself, because you're going to be asking the person where they are, and they're not marking that from 1 to 5. They're actually bringing their description of that. So just kind of linking that in there, Rory. But wow, yeah, I agree with you. Getting used to those tools, knowing how to use them, really important.
Yeah, absolutely. And there can be they can be manipulated. I spoke to someone who was worked for the NHS, and they were of course everybody's jobs on the line, and saying things like, well, you say it's a 6, but actually you said you felt much better last week. So they can be manipulated, and so they are useful, but they don't tell, as you say, they don't tell the whole story. They're virtually a snapshot, as all statistics are. The real evidence is in qualitative, where clients may fill in an outcome questionnaire with their own experience, and it's a mixture of both. But yeah, it's the modern world. So I applaud people who, as I said before, hold the person-centered flame up. I'm afraid that it's not the era that we live in.
Yeah, I agree. And as we kind of leave this topic, maybe, Rory, an opportunity for a lecture for our Counselling Study Resource members on this, because it is practice related. It is like you say, it's 2019 right now as we make this podcast. It is something that is required in most agencies, in most placements. It may be something we can look at. So maybe something to look forward to there. I know we have already got some CSR resources on the assessment tools, but maybe something in the pipeline there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that how to use them, I think, is the critical thing. Having the assessment tool is one thing. Knowing how to use it and how questions to ask and when to use it, that is a whole different thing.
I agree, and that's why I kind of brought that up, because I know that it's a piece of paper where someone is maybe marking themselves from a 1 to a 5 or whatever that may be, but it can be put across in a person-centered way. So yeah, okay, moving away from the assessment tools, practice matters now, where we kind of look at what happens in practice, and we're speaking about unethical behavior, and I guess we can find ourselves in hot water without really knowing it. One of the surprises for me when I did my supervision training was how most unethical behavior is kind of a gray area, and you can find yourself acting unethically without purposely doing so. It doesn't have to be the biggies, it doesn't have to be the obvious ones like breaking confidentiality. It can be something that is said, done in therapy or outside of therapy that you didn't fully realize was unethical, and you can find yourself in a difficult situation.
You can. I mean, I can give you an example of very unethical behaviour. A long time ago, when I just qualified and I just started teaching, I bumped into someone, and he was kind of making light of the fact that he'd been with a client who he said was a bit boring, and he'd fallen asleep. He'd fallen. I know you can't see this on the podcast, but Ken's kind of
wincing. I think I'm wincing. There's the visual. There's the description.
He'd fallen asleep, and when he woke up, the clients had gone.
Sorry, I don't laugh. I think it might be out of shock. Wow, that's like a bad skit.
It is.
That's like the skit of therapy that you might see on a comedy show. Whoa. Okay, that is very clearly unethical.
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to this. So let's pick up with unethical behaviour in practice matters with Rory after this short message. Take the stress out of your counselling studies and get the support of Rory and I by joining us in the Counselling Study Resource. See how Counselling Study Resource can help you. Visit counsellingtutor.com. That's counsellingtutor.com.
I often get asked, what is unethical behaviour? And I know that some awarding bodies ask specifically for what actions could clients bring against the therapist and for what reason. So what I'm going to do today in this podcast is I'm going to go through some of the most common areas of complaints and what could be viewed as unethical behaviour. Counselling is, by its very nature, requires both sensitivity and a clear understanding of right and wrong. counsellors agree to abide by a code of practice if they're a member of an ethical body, which I believe all counsellors should be a member of an ethical body. And I know there's some people who take a principled view on that, but that's where I stand. I think people should join an ethical body purely because it means there's a complaints procedure in process. If something goes wrong, a client can make a complaint and there can be some form of arbitration. Also, there's ethical frameworks. They're written and authored by ethical bodies, such as the British Association for Counselling and Psychotherapy, the BACP, the National Counselling Society, also known as the NCS, and the United Kingdom Council for Psychotherapy, also known as the UKCP. So what are some of the most common and maybe not so common complaints levied against counsellors and psychotherapists? Well, perhaps the biggest, and I've alluded to this in other podcasts, is endings. There's been a lot of reported complaints upheld, certainly in ethical bodies periodicals, about practitioners finishing clients without any kind of ending at all. Clients turning up to see the therapist only to be told, well, therapy's ended. Or having no idea that therapy will come to an end. This is where contracting is so important. You know, if you're working in a time-limited way, saying to the client, you know, hey, we're working in a time-limited way. There's 12 sessions. How do you want to use that time? And also reminding the client when they get to, say, 6 sessions that there's only a few sessions left. And also counting down. In my practice, as we're coming to the end, I will count down the sessions and say, I realise that there's 2 sessions left, just to make the client aware so there's no surprises or clients feel abandoned at the end of their therapy. It's really good practice. With open-ended therapy, it's also good practice to talk about how long the client may want to come and what they want to get from therapy, just as an idea so that therapy doesn't drift on forever, allowing the client to have the autonomy to say, well, I think I've got what I needed now. So endings is the biggest complaint. What other areas of unethical behaviour are they? Well, breaches of confidentiality, sharing clients' information without their consent. And I have to say this is especially prevalent on social media, where some therapists think it's just fine to ask about a client's presentations or ask for advice on Facebook pages. I always thought that if I've got any difficulties or need some insight with clients, I go to my supervisor because my supervisor's got more experience than me. She has a greater insight. She may be able to see things that I can't see. That's why supervision is such a consultative and collaborative process. That's why it's so wonderful. Yet people post on Facebook pages. I see it all the time on Facebook pages where counsellors reside. I have this client, and then they list the presentation and they list what's going on for them. And it doesn't take too much of a stretch for either the client to see that, because sometimes clients will follow their therapist, certainly if they can find them. So that's something to have a think about. And also, it may be that some friend of the therapist sees this and says, I know, some friend of the client sees this and says, I know who this client is. You know, so sharing and asking for advice on social media, why would anybody ask, 10,000 random people for clinical advice? You could be dealing with anybody. So I think that's breach of confidentiality. And I think personally it's unethical. If you need professional collaboration, by all means speak with another therapist or your supervisor, but I would avoid Facebook pages. That's my personal views. Being nosy is another one. I started counselling long before we had Facebook and social media and any way of connecting ourselves together, even before YouTube. So it's quite a new thing, social media, in our world. And it's surprising how many therapists look their clients up on Facebook or Twitter or social media. Now, the thing is that with some social media, you can do that with anonymity. In other words, if you look up someone on Facebook, as far as I know, and don't quote me on this, No one would ever know you were looking. However, some social media networks, such as LinkedIn, which is a professional network, will alert you if somebody is looking at your profile. And I know of a few therapists who've been caught out this way. They've been looking at their clients' profiles, and the clients said, "Why were you looking at my profile?" Because it's not a small jump, is it, to think, well, if they're looking at my LinkedIn profile, are they looking at other things about me? And again, complaints have been raised and upheld because people have been, quite frankly, nosy. The client has a right to be anonymous. And in fact, I was talking to another professional in another profession, and this particular person was laughing, saying that she regularly looked up her clients on Facebook. And I said, in my profession, if someone found that out, you would be in a lot of trouble. And she had no conception at all. She wasn't a therapist. She was in a different profession. But she had no conception at all of the fact that looking up a client's, or in her case, a patient's details was intrusive. It is intrusive. We should leave our clients at the door. They go off into their own lives, and we should let them be. We shouldn't be looking at them or finding what they're doing or searching for them. In my view, it's unethical. Dual relationships. Therapists who know the client in a different capacity, maybe a work colleague, and counsel them as well. Many years ago, I had a conversation with someone who wanted to do a diploma in counselling, and they said, "I've got a placement." I said, "Oh, very good. You've been very proactive." And she said, "Yeah. She said, I work in the HR department." So I said, "Oh, brilliant." She said, "And we're having some redundancies, so I could counsel those people." So I said, "Whoa, hang on a second." I said, "At one level, you're the person whose name's going to appear on the letter of redundancy. And on the other hand, you're saying you're going to counsel them." I said, "That's totally unethical." And genuinely, the person I was speaking to just did not get it. And she got quite angry. And I said, "You cannot be someone's HR manager and counsel them." And I've come across organisations who've discovered that one of their employees is training to be a counsellor and has actually asked them to counsel people they're making redundant. Totally unethical and totally wrong. And of course, it puts a lot of pressure on people who are employed, because they've got to say to the employer, "Well, I can't do that." What else? Well, having a romantic or sexual relationship with a client, or contacting them between sessions without having a good reason. I was recently on a training program with a colleague who wasn't a therapist. He came from a related profession, and he was telling me that he'd had some difficulties in his life. He went to see a psychotherapist, and she made a big point of saying to him, "I don't have sexual relationships with my clients," which I thought was a bit of an odd thing to say to a client. It's not the sort of thing I would say, and I really don't know anybody else who would say that. But she made a point of saying that, and then on the third appointment, asked him for his phone number and wondered if he'd like to go out for a drink. At which point he told her that he didn't think that was a good idea and found himself another psychotherapist. So yeah, that kind of thing happens. I know that's happened on a couple of occasions with people I know about, not anybody I know personally, but people I know about. And also contacting clients between sessions for no good reasons. Recently I was unwell and I had to contact some of my clients and apologise and say I couldn't make appointments. And I think that was an ethical thing to do and the correct thing to do, because I couldn't make the appointments, and it was contracted. It's in my contract that I can contact my clients in between sessions if there's, for want of a better word, an emergency. But there have been therapists who've just phoned their clients up out of the blue or emailed them for no good reason. And again, this is an area where therapists can find themselves in quite deep water and complaints are upheld. One of the other areas that really concerns me is working beyond levels of competence. Advertising or working with presentations which are beyond the scope of training or competence. I hear on a reasonable regular basis therapists who take on clients who I would, even with my level of experience and training, would be uncomfortable taking on because their presentations are out of my knowledge. I'm not trained for working with clients with certain presentations. An example of that is I wouldn't take on a client who had alcohol or drug dependency, where that was their prime difficulty. That is a specialist form of counselling that needs to be undertaken by someone who's trained in that area. Nor would I work with somebody who wants to talk about adoption in England. It's not in the whole of the UK, but certainly in England, I think in Wales. If someone wants to talk about adoption, specifically about their adoption, then you have to go through a counsellor who is trained in adoption counselling. Yet I do hear of people who work with adoptees on a regular basis with adoption. So that's always a little bit worrying. And I have seen therapist websites where they've advertised working with all sorts of presentations, and yet their qualifications don't seem to match up, which is a bit worrying. Finally, gay conversion therapy. Now, thankfully, about 4 years ago, ethical bodies wrote to practitioners and said it is absolutely not ethical. It's a prescribed act. In other words, you can't do it, to work with clients to try and change their sexuality. And also to say to clients that being gay is a mental illness. Now, I have to say that up until I think 1980, if I'm correct, it was in the diagnostics manuals that being gay was a mental illness. And of course, as time goes on, this has been removed, thankfully. And in fact, I've got a book in my library called Teach Yourself Psychiatry. So it's not a book you could teach yourself psychiatry with. And it talks about gay people being, and I quote, deviant. I'm quoting the book there. And it's an old book, and it's one I removed many years ago from a college I worked at because I thought it was inappropriate to have in the library. So I pruned it out of the library, but I kept it as an historical artifact. And I use it occasionally in training to show just how things have changed. But there are still therapists who will say, either privately or even publicly, that being gay is a mental illness and that therapy is needed to help people get back onto the pathway of heterosexuality. And of course, that is unethical and damaging. You know, there's been plenty of research on individuals who've undergone gay conversion therapy, and it just hasn't worked. And I think the reasons for that are pretty obvious. So a final word of reassurance. I think that any profession will have a few rotten eggs or incompetent practitioners. I live down the road from Hyde, the little town of Hyde, where we had Harold Shipman. There's no better example, if that's the word you can use, of someone who was just evil and horrible and not upholding the values of a medical practitioner. So, you know, there are people who do wrong in all professions, but generally I think most therapists go through their professional career working in the service of the client and trying to do the best possible job.
Well, there you have it. Thank you as always, Rory. Unethical behaviour, something really worth looking at. Not when we find ourselves in a situation where that behaviour is played out, but beforehand. That's what we do. We inform ourselves by listening to the Counselling Tutor podcast. And you can get Rory's super duper handout. And the best part is it is free, just like this podcast. And to get Rory's super duper handout, go to counsellingtutor.com. That's our website, counsellingtutor.com, 2 L's in counselling. We're based in the United Kingdom. Click on the podcasts tab. navigate your way to episode 106. That's today's episode. All of the show notes are right there on that page with any links to external resources from the topics that we've discussed today. And right there on that page, you can download Rory's super duper handout on unethical behavior from right there within the page. Just put in your name and your email address and we will send that to you. And of course, if you are already a member of our paid for resource, which is called the Counselling Study Resource, well, that handout has already been added to your handouts vault. No need to download it. It's there for you. Just log in and enjoy it. So moving away from unethical behavior into another question that came through on the Counselling Tutor Facebook page. What level should I train at? What level should I train to? Wow, this comes up again and again, Rory.
It does. And more to the point, where do you start? Traditional courses have been a short level 2, maybe 10 weeks at level 2 here in the UK, and then a level 3 for a year, and then a 2-year diploma would have been the vocational path. And as a tutor, about this time of year, as we got towards the end of the academic year, I would get phone calls from people saying, I want to go straight onto level 4, I want to go straight onto level 3. And it can cause a lot of confusion and sometimes a lot of bad feeling when a tutor says to a potential student, well, you're going to have to do level 3 and then you have to do level 4. And there's some good reasons for this. There's very few qualifications that actually match, well, I can't think of any, that actually match counselling training. So it's so unique that we talk about accreditation of prior learning, or APL. So sometimes, you can join courses at a higher level if you've done another course. It's a bit more tricky in counselling because a lot of counselling training isn't about the theory. It's also about how that theory relates to you. In fact, I've just given a lecture in the CSR about theory related to our own personal development. So that isn't really covered. It's certainly not covered on things like psychology courses or anything like that. It's a unique experience. So usually we ask people to start at level 2, 10-week course. The reason for that is because sometimes at the end, people have said, it's not for me, counselling. It's not for me. And it's really unfair if you start people at a level 3 course and then halfway through they go, it's not for me. The numbers diminish. The course itself becomes, not as rich and as an exciting course. So the 10-week level 2 is really a filter. And I've had some wonderful people do level 2 courses who are, I want to be a counsellor. When they got to the end, they said, I want to be a social worker. I want to do this. I want to do that. Because a lot of people come to training not knowing what counselling is. That's a difficulty. And also, the other thing about asking people to do a level 3 course is because a lot of placements want a level 3 qualification before they'll take you on. So it's not that the training provider is trying to make more money out of you. It's if you go to a placement and they say, so have you got a certificate in counselling skills? Well, no, I've got this. It may not be the best fit for them because you're working with an outside employer. So usually level 3, and then you can go, once you've done a level 3, you can do a level 4, or you could go on to do a degree, or you can even go on to do a master's degree from a level 3 if you're academically capable of doing that. Quite tricky and sometimes quite disappointing when people have got a lot of previous qualifications and they're told they have to do a level 3 first.
And I guess the question that kind of links into this is at what level are you client facing, and that would be second year level 4 that you would be qualified to be client facing. And I hear what you're saying, and I've seen the same kind of comments on the Facebook group where people are kind of disappointed by that. They want to get out and they want to help and they want to be of use, and I kind of understand that counselling training is so different, as you quite rightly pointed out, Rory, than learning anything else that I can think of as well, in that there is a massive element of personal development involved. It's about us being able to look at ourselves and discover our own hidden issues, I guess, if you want to call it, understand who we are, what prejudices do we hold, and by the very nature, these are things that are unseen to us. There's an exercise called Johari's window. You only have to do that in one lesson to understand how many behaviors can be unseen. to us ourselves. And by seeing new parts of ourselves, by working in personal development groups, getting feedback from peers, from tutors, having our practice watched and looked at when we do simulated skills sessions, that's where we grow. And that's why counselling is ineffective online. You can learn the theory, you can say all 19 of Carl Rogers' propositions word for word. It does not a counsellor make. It is so much more than that. It's not just the theory element of it. And you quite rightly said, Rory, personal development, that's something that we write about at assignment level to be able to get through. And it takes time. Personal development is not something you can read in a book and go, I get it now. It's something that has to grow. It's something we have to experience and go through it. And that is why counselling training is long. And the thoughts are that it should be longer by many. In many countries it is longer, a lot longer, and a lot more rigorous. A very interesting topic indeed. But I think when it comes to what level you should train at, it's about what you want to do with the qualification. If you want to be a client-facing counsellor, then you need to have at least a level 4 certificate in counselling that will so that you can go out and begin your practicing. But if you have a level 3, there are so many other doors that open for you. You can do any kind of job where listening skills are required, where you're not counselling, but the skills and the theory that you've learnt will stand you in very, very good stead. And even a level 2 introduction to counselling can be really, really useful if you, say, work with people on an ongoing basis and you just want to have those listening skills in place and have an understanding of how people psyche works and some of the base theories.
Yeah, absolutely. I've taught some fantastic learners on level 3 courses who've gone on to use counselling skills in a variety of work, police service. I taught a radiologist, someone who did x-rays on people. At the time, I don't know if it's called x-rays now, but she was a radiologist. I've taught people who worked in victim support. I've taught people who've worked as teachers. So they've gone away with a whole really useful tool bag of counselling skills, and more to the point, a real solid understanding of themselves, their own, what's sometimes referred to as an intrapsychic process, their own motivations, which, let's face it, when you're working with anybody, it's you that you bring in to any meeting, be it therapeutic or any other professional meeting. And if you're not sure of yourself, boy, will that show. And that's what the level 3 course is really good at doing, helping people understand themselves.
100%. If you're listening to this and maybe you're just considering whether counselling might be right for you, that's the reason that 10-week introduction to counselling course, at least in the UK, is there, because you're going to know. You're going to have a very good idea by the end of that. So the levels are there for a reason, and I think that they work pretty well. We'll see how that goes. There's talk of that changing as we go into the future, but more news on that when it comes. You'll always get the most up-to-date news right here on the Counselling Tutor Podcast. That was episode 106, Rory, of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Kicked off looking at using assessment tools in counselling. Practice matters, a real good one today, looking at that unethical behaviour, and of course ending off with what level should I study at, or should I study to?
Yeah, what a great episode. And hey, stay grounded and stay safe.
Take the stress out of your counselling studies and get the support of Rory and I by joining us in the Counselling Study Resource. Counselling Study Resource, or CSR for short, is the world's most comprehensive assignment guidance and study support resource for students just like you of counselling and psychotherapy. See how Counselling Study Resource can help you. Visit counsellingtutor.com. That's counsellingtutor.com.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Find the show notes for this episode on our website at www.counsellingtutor.com.